Good morning, everybody. We're glad to have you here with us. We're having today a technical webinar on the FSC Policy for Association Remediation Framework. My name is Amparo Arellano. I'm going to be the moderator today for today's session, but I also work in dispute resolution team in FSC International. For those that don't know me, we have on the line Salem Jones, which is the program manager of FSC dispute resolution at FSC International. We also have Alex Green, which is also part of our dispute resolution team here in Bonn. And we have Anna Jenkins and Shizuka Yasui, which are both the technical experts that have been heavily involved in developing the FSC remediation framework. So all of us are the people and the faces that you have behind this framework that we're proposing today. So today's session is a technical session. We already had an initiation informational session on Wednesday. So our hope today is to go a bit more in detail on the more technical stuff and then to really open up for discussion among the group. Next slide, please. The main objectives of the webinar are really to allow for conversation and to get feedback from your end. So we really want to open up and get your comments and your input with regards to this proposal, this framework. And we want to try to get into a little bit of more detail than we did on Wednesday for those that are really interested in the technicalities of this. And ultimately, for us, success today is to really, when we make sure that you have really received the information that you need and that you have had a good opportunity to provide feedback to us. And if it's not enough throughout the session today, that you really understand well what the different opportunities will be in the future to continue providing feedback to this process. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder, we are recording this. So for those of you that don't want to be in the recording, you can switch off your camera. Otherwise, we will put this recording on the FSC website afterwards. And we are providing simultaneous translation to Bahasa Indonesian. So you just have to click on one of the two under the toolbar and you can access the presentation and translate it. If you have any issues with that, just let us know. Next slide, please. Housekeeping rules on how to engage. We're hoping that there's going to be a lot of conversation today, so we do want to keep organized. We have the chat box in Zoom where you can write your comments and your questions, and you can also raise your hand, and we will be giving the floor to people in order of conversation. And also when we see that certain comments or questions are more popular, we would also focus on that. If any of you have provided previous questions in advance to this webinar, which are really not many, we would then also address those first as a priority. If you want to keep it anonymous, you can also message me via Zoom, and then you can send the question to me, and I can also provide it in the chat box so that you keep anonymous throughout the webinar. Next slide. One change with regards to how we follow through on Wednesday is that on top of the Zoom chat, we're also going to be using Slido. The reason for this is because we think it's going to really facilitate our conversation, and it has some nice tools in terms of polls and ways of like voting to different comments. So we will get a better understanding of your feeling about this process. So if you don't feel comfortable with Slido, you can still stay with Zoom. That's okay. You could also send me the questions that you want to include in Slido, and I could include them in Slido for you. But if ideally you engage or at least give an attempt to join this platform, and then for that you have to access slido.com, and then you need to enter FSC Rem Frem as it's written under the fourth bullet in the slide. And that would be the code that leads you to the conversation. It's actually quite easy. I've done it myself a couple minutes ago and it's working fairly easy. And then there you just can write your comments as well. So we would like to try to focus the conversation on Slido, but we're going to definitely be making sure that comments on Zoom chat are also considered and try to really address all of them. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for today. So we're trying to be brief in terms of the content of the presentation so that we have a lot of space for questions at the end. So as the first point of the agenda, we will have Salem explain a little bit about the FSC Policy for Association Remediation Framework, just a recap on the main points. And then Anna Jenkins, as technical expert drafting this framework as well, she's going to be running us through a specific set of sections of this framework in detail. And those are sections U, T, and R. And she'll go into the level of performance indicators, which is something that we did not cover on Wednesday. We are going to have another technical webinar on the 22nd of July, and our thought was that there's a lot of content for only today. So how we have organized this is that the other sections that are not U, T, and R will be covered in the technical webinar on the 22nd of July. So she will cover UT and R sections in detail, and then we will move into the Q&A. And that's going to be the core of today's session, where we hope that we really get engagement and lots of questions and comments. So this is how we're going to operate today. The only last remark that I want to make is that please take into consideration that the conversation is around creating a generic or a general high-level framework. So the questions and comments should really be targeted to this framework, and we really want to avoid having questions that are directed about specific companies, disassociated or not. We really want to keep our conversation about the framework and the requirements. Next slide, please. So I'll hand over now to Salem, who's going to give us the first part of the presentation. And yeah, Salem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amparo. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this technical webinar on the Policy for Association Remediation Framework. Excuse me. It's good to see all of you. We're very pleased that you're able to join us for this deep dive into the requirements and indicators in the framework today. Just as a general landscape of the remediation framework and FSC's motivations in engaging in the remediation framework process is to encourage companies to improve and transform their forest operations, to provide organizations that have a legacy of policy for association issues and violations to change their ways, and to provide them a second chance to engage with FSC, to drive positive change in the world's forests, and to co-create resilient communities of forest-dependent peoples and peoples living in the forest. Next slide, please. The overall objectives of the remediation framework is to address policy for association violations. Those policy for association violations, in case you are not aware, the policy for association articulates 6 unacceptable activities. And those unacceptable activities are listed here in the 6 bullet points: significant conversion, destruction of high conservation values, illegal logging and trade in illegal forest products, violation of traditional and human rights, violation of ILO core conventions, and use of GMO in forestry operations. For those of you that have gone through the remediation framework, you will have noticed that there's only a placeholder in the remediation framework for use of GMO in forestry operations. We have not come to requirements or indicators articulating a remedy process for addressing GMO in forestry operations. The reason for this is that FSC has never had a policy for association case on the unacceptable activity of use of GMO. So we actually do not have the case experience in working with this particular violation. And in addition to that, we do not have indicators for assessing use of GMO in forestry operations. So for this reason, the use of GMO in forestry operations, there's just a placeholder there right now, and this will be subject of future conversations through the forestry, through the forest, I think it's called Forest Futures. It changed its name recently. Another objective, of course, of the remediation framework, aside from addressing a remedy process for unacceptable activities is also to rebuild trust with the market and with rights holders and stakeholders. Rights holders and stakeholders that have been affected, impacted by these unacceptable activities. And looking forward into the future to prevent reoccurrence of further violations of the FSC policy for association. So to create lasting and sustainable transformation of operations and quality management systems to ensure that such violations do not happen again. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the process and where we are. We will also review this at the end of the presentation again, just so everyone's clear on the process we're in and the next steps. We are currently in the consultation period of the remediation framework. This is the first draft. This is the first time this document has been released for public consultation. And that public consultation goes until the 21st of August. We will then receive and review all of the stakeholder comments and stakeholder input from public consultation. That includes input that we receive from these webinars. We will be developing also questions and input as an outcome of this particular webinar, as well as those on Wednesday, to actually be part of our information stream that we use for revising this draft. That will be this revision process and review of stakeholder comments will be done in October. And we will start a new drafting phase starting in October through December of this year. We will bring to the FSC International Board an update in November of 2021, providing the stakeholder comments and input that we received during public consultation, as well as providing them with the document where we've gotten to thus far. An important note here is that as we are moving, as we are progressing in public consultation for this remediation framework, there's of course two other connected processes, which is the review of the policy for association. So that policy, which articulates the unacceptable activities, is currently being reviewed and undergoing public consultation, as well as the conversion remedy procedure, which is a parallel related remedy process for the activity of conversion. And because we are going to public consultation at around the same time, we will also benefit from stakeholder input and stakeholder comments that we will be able to aggregate and also improve all three of these documents at the same time. So starting in January of 2022, we plan to move to the second public consultation of the remediation framework and then come to a final product in April of 2022. And then we would present that final product to the FSC International Board in June of 2022, so June next year. Next slide, please. We're opening up many different channels for public consultation, for feedback to the remediation framework. So the public consultation forum is of course open until the 21st of August. You can submit your comments through the consultation forum. You will also, we've had webinars this week on Wednesday. We have this webinar today. We have one planned for the 22nd of July, and we will plan others as needed. We will also, there's also opportunities for conference calls or for emails on an at-needs basis. And there are, of course, different membership, FSC membership dialogues, which are happening in parallel to public consultation around the conversion policy called the conversion dialogues. So there's lots of opportunity to participate, to provide feedback, and to have your voice heard. Next slide, please. I just wanted to provide you a very simplistic overview of the development of the remediation framework and how we got to this document. As many of you know, there was a stakeholder working group that was put together to help FSC develop the roadmap conditions for Asia Pulp and Paper. That stakeholder working group, together with FSC, put together the requirements and indicators and guidance for a draft roadmap for the Asia Pulp and Paper ending disassociation process. That was a quite mature draft. It was the product of many long days and nights and in-person meetings to put that draft together. So it was in quite a good shape when the APP roadmap was suspended. So when that roadmap was suspended, we then began the development of what we called the generic roadmap. It became clear to us in that stakeholder working group that we really needed a normative basis, a standardized approach that we could refer to that would guide all ending disassociation processes. And so essentially from the APP roadmap, which was a very mature draft, we moved into genericizing those requirements and indicators so that it could be applied at minimum to a regional Southeast Asian context, and ideally in a global context. So in the development of that generic roadmap, as it was called, we kept the basic structure of the APP roadmap, but we started to generalize the requirements, indicators, and language in that document. We introduced a concept of a remediation governance body, which is appointed to manage the overall implementation of the ending disassociation conditions. And we also started pulling out the time requirements for particular milestones. We'll go into this later, but some of the thinking around removing those timelines was really came from our discussions with social chamber members and with those working on the FPIC guidance, that it is really not conducive to coming to sustainable and fair agreements with communities and impacted rights holders if there's too much time pressure put on coming to those agreements. That there needs to be time and space allowed for agreements to be fairly and genuinely made between organizations and communities. And so for that reason, we started removing those timelines and moving toward a more maximum time threshold, which I will cover in the next slide. From the generic roadmap, we then started working very closely in 2020 with the conversion remedy procedure technical working group, as well as interfacing with the conversion policy working group on their work for remedying conversion. And in our work with this, with these two groups, we made some further adjustments or further realizations that, number one, the remedy as it applies to the policy for association is not only applicable at the point of ending disassociation, but the policy for association applies to certification of course, at the beginning of a relationship or of association between an organization and FSC. And so the remedy process itself was thought to also need to be applied at the time of certification, at the point of associating or at the point of certification. And so for this reason, you will see the remediation framework applies to a pre-certification, pre-association remedy for violation of the policy for association, as well as to maintaining association or conditional association, and then also to ending disassociation. So it covers the entire spectrum. There's also some changes in the overall structure of the document. So we moved from presenting the information in tracks to presenting the information in a more universal plus modular approach. So those are some of the changes that you will see in the development of this document over time. I think that's a good overview of where we've come from and where we are. Next slide, please. I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the overall structure of the remediation framework from the point of view of a linear process. You will notice that the remediation framework is not a linear process. So this is a bit of a fictitious presentation of the framework, but it's done in a way to provide an overview of what progression through the framework would look like. I'm going to use the example actually of an organization-specific roadmap to walk you through this picture. The remediation framework is not an organization-specific roadmap. Of course, it's the high-level framework that would govern the development of an organization-specific roadmap, but it's easier to apply this if we think about this applying to an actual case. So what you have on the left before the start mark are the prerequisites. These prerequisites are all of the conditions that an organization would have to fulfill before even moving into the drafting of a company-specific roadmap phase. These prerequisites are there to ensure that an organization has the commitment and the necessary drive and resources to actually engage in a remediation framework process. You then move into the mark number 1, which is the milestone for the development of the organization-specific roadmap. This entails drafting of the roadmap based on the remediation framework. It entails stakeholder consultation to receive input and additional stakeholder comments on the organization-specific roadmap, and to ultimately come to a final document that would be presented to the FSC International Board of Directors for approval. Once that milestone is reached, we would move into number 2, which is the implementation phase. The organization would start the implementation of the roadmap, putting all of the necessary organizational, operational, and infrastructure pieces in place in order to operationalize the implementation of that roadmap. This would also include FSC's verification, third-party verification piece. So FSC would be responsible for ensuring third-party verification of the major milestones in the company-specific roadmap. Excuse me. You would, then move to number 3, which is the milestones around restorative actions. Restorative actions entail demonstrated independent governance of the implementation of the company-specific roadmap. It includes verification of robust stakeholder processes at every stage defined in the company-specific roadmap, and self-responsibility, which is the state in which the organization takes ownership and responsibility for the implementation of the roadmap and for achieving the milestones. We then move into number 4, This is the verification for ending disassociation. At this stage, we would like to see that by a maximum threshold, in this example, we have 5 years. Depending on the complexity of the roadmap, it could be more, could be less. But within a reasonable amount of time that the organization has fulfilled their thresholds, fulfilled their milestones, and successfully passed the verification for those thresholds and milestones in order for FSC to take a decision on ending the disassociation with the company. This is obviously a monumental milestone, and one which would allow the company to move into a reassociation process, either through recertification or other association with FSC. It does not mean that the roadmap is complete at that stage. It does mean that the roadmap would continue and that any association with FSC would still be conditional upon the completion of that roadmap. And then ultimately, we have number 5, when the organization specific roadmap has been completed, it's been verified, all of the thresholds and milestones have been completed, they've been verified, and the FSC International Board of Directors takes a decision to formally end the roadmap with the organization. So this is what we call the five phase approach, or the 5 lines model. And we might come back to this as a reference point throughout this webinar. I think next slide. I think from here, I would pass over to Anna Jenkins to do a deep dive into the actual roadmap, into the actual remediation framework. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Salem. Okay, so we saw this slide on the webinar a couple of days ago, those of you who are with us. So a quick recap, the orange sections on the left, this is section U, the universal requirements, section T, which are trust building measures, and section R, which is the general approach to remedy of harm procedure. Those are all universal, those all apply in all cases, no matter what. And then on the right-hand side, the grey and the blue and yellow areas, those will apply on a case-by-case basis, depending on whether what type of harm is present. So at the bottom, there is a remedy of environmental harm in the turquoise, and in the yellow is remedy of social harm. And then we have in the grey areas sections A to F, which reflect the PFA policy elements. And so there's more detail within these sections to guide users which sections will apply in which cases, and then more detailed requirements for different cases in some of these sections. Some don't have extra detail in. Today, we're going to focus in this presentation on section U, section T, and just one part of section R. Now, I'm not going to go through every single requirement in great detail because else we'll use up all the time. So what we've done is we picked some areas that we know will be of particular interest and that are also perhaps unusual, more, less usual. And that doesn't mean you can't ask questions about anything different. You really can. We're just going to kick off with a bit of focus, but then we can focus in on other pieces. It'll be great if that's mainly sections U, T, and R, well, at least one part of R, which I'll get into in the next slides. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. Okay, so these are the universal requirements. Now, these established a foundational infrastructure, principles and procedures for implementing the remediation framework. And also for, in general, ensuring that harm is prevented, or risks are spotted, mitigating actions taken, and then if harm occurs, remedy of harm. So next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about in relation to section U is the parties that are involved in organisation-specific roadmaps. Now, obviously, this applies throughout the entire remediation framework. So these parties are quite obviously FSC and the company or the organisation. So that would be the company that's acting on behalf of a company group. There's stakeholders, of course, and rights holders, who are the core, most important subsection of stakeholders. Then we have the FSC third-party verifier. So that's the independent body contracted by FSC to verify all the various aspects of the company-specific roadmap. And this is set out in the remediation framework. There's peer review. There's quite a lot of peer reviews throughout the remediation framework, and that's by independent experts. And then there's the remediation governance body. And let's go to the next slide and see how all these interact. So down the left, the infrastructure pieces, these are all parts of section U. And we've got one part of section R there, which is the registry of harm. And then we have the actors all along the top. Obviously, FSC is involved in writing the remediation framework and overseeing all of these processes. But specifically in the day-to-day application and development, then the company has a role, specific roles, and the rights holders, stakeholders will have specific roles. There'll be verifiers and then independent experts. So the first piece, infrastructure piece, is the remediation governance body. So the company will be involved in drafting terms of reference, initial terms of reference, and that needs to be emphasized. And some administration, but perhaps not later, but the very first seeds definitely are in the hands of the company. Rights holders and stakeholders will participate in this, and the verifier will assess the first formation of the remediation governance body, and then there'll be independent experts participating. I'm going to get into more detail on this in a couple of slides. So a grievance mechanism is required to be established. This will be managed and operated by the company. It does also have an independent oversight board. Now that independent oversight board could be this remediation governance body. That would be for people to decide who are involved. We don't specify who that should be, but the remediation governance body would meet those requirements. The remediation governance body anyway does need to review and assess every couple of years and check that things are going well. Verifiers will assess the grievance mechanism and there will be peer review of it. So then FPIC. FPIC needs to apply throughout the whole remediation framework where FPIC is applicable. So the company is involved in implementing that. Remediation governance body will review how that's going and ensure rights holders are interacting. And the verifier will assess those processes, and again, there'll be peer review. With identification of rights holders and stakeholders, again, that's the company's role to ensure that they are identified. The remediation governance body checks that, checks it's happening, oversees it, just like any board would with activities. And again, it's verified, and again, peer review. With due diligence framework, this is another section I'm going to get into more detail in today. The company obviously must implement due diligence frameworks, both environmental and human rights. Again, it's reviewed by the remediation governance body and communication coming from them. And then we have verification again, and peer review and independent monitoring. by independent experts. They won't be the same experts. Registry of Harm sits in section R, and this is the place, I'll also be discussing this more today. This is where where harm, when it's identified, will be gathered into the Registry of Harm. And again, it's got these review points, it's got verification, independent FSC verifier, looking at that, and again, peer review. And then we have transparency and progress, demonstration of progress. I'll talk about that in more detail as well. And then we see that the company has a role here, the FSC verifier has a role here, and we'll also obviously be trying to make sure, the whole point of this is that rights holders and stakeholders have access to information as well as independent experts and any interested parties. Okay, next slide, please. So this is an overview of all the requirements, the first half of requirements in the universal requirements section. And the yellow highlighted areas are places I'm going to focus on today. And again, it's fine for you to ask questions about any of these requirements. We just don't want to go through all of them in detail unless we know you want to focus in on them. Next slide, please. And again, these are the ones I'll focus on. So let's move straight into the remediation governance body. Okay, so requirement 1.2 says a remediation governance body needs to be established. So what exactly is that? So it's in looking at the indicators now, it needs to be a semi-independent, self-managed remediation governance body. So that means those around the table will decide its management. It means it isn't necessarily managed by company administrators, for example, that those around the table may choose to employ someone that's quite independent from the company, you know, to do the administration, secretarial work, etc. The rights holders, other stakeholders, social and environmental independent experts, and representatives of the company group. So representatives of rights holders, I should say, not all the rights holders. There will be representatives from each of these groups around the table. And 75% of these members around the table need to not be connected with the company group. There needs to be diversity balance, and that will be checked with the and actually the only verification by the FSC verifier. There needs to be self-management governance principles. So again, this isn't like a stakeholder consultation session. This is actual governance of people sitting together forming a board. And yes, that first constituted group will be verified. Next slide, please. So what will they actually do? So their terms of reference is for them to draw up, but we start with pointing the way in the remediation framework. So they review impacts and outcomes of the remedy of harm processes. They may conduct or oversee directly and closely some topic-specific stakeholder consultation. They will absolutely oversee the roadmap milestones and ensure they're delivered. They will oversee that stakeholder consultation processes are going well in a good way. And they'll review specific methodologies, policies, and procedures. And these are highlighted throughout the remediation framework. And they would oversee the appointment of independent experts. Next slide, please. So here's a picture to show you what that would look like. So in red, we have representatives of the company group. In blue at the top, we have other stakeholders. That would include broader stakeholders. At the bottom in brown are the rights holders. So these would be representatives of those who have suffered harm. And then we have social and environmental independent experts. So altogether, that needs to be 75% of those around the table are not from the company group. Next slide. So let's move on and have a look at due diligence frameworks. So we have two requirements, 1.8 and 1.9, and these pretty much mirror each other, so we'll deal with them together. So 1.8 covers human rights due diligence and 1.9 is environmental due diligence. So these due diligence frameworks, they need to be able to identify potential impacts through risk assessments. Human rights due diligence has come up with a very easy to understand concept of salient issues. So we have salient human rights issues. We're also choosing to apply that to environmental issues as well. It's used much less commonly in the environmental sector, but it will mean the same thing. If these salient issues are those issues that are most likely to occur, and obviously we have ones that are sector specific. So both there'll be sector specific ones and then very salient issues which are will be specific to company situations perhaps. So these need to be identified and focused on. So in identifying the salient issues, they need to be prioritized. You know, what's the most likely thing that could happen? And so that keeps the focus on looking at what's most likely to occur and trying to ensure it doesn't occur. There will then be actual impact assessments. So human rights impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, what's actually happened, what's actual impacts and has harm occurred. Any harm identified is recorded in the registry of harm. Then a general principle throughout the remediation framework, you have to learn from experience and modify procedures accordingly, especially in the early days. And then track and report to stakeholders and publicly on those websites that we're coming to. So then there's an indicator requesting independent monitoring. So independent monitoring reports on progress. These public summaries need to be published again on those websites. And there's a stakeholder question about independent monitoring if you want to get more into that detail. We really appreciate your input. And then lastly, the systems that are developed, the sector specific and salient issues are reviewed and verified by the remediation governance body, the peer review, it's peer reviewed by independent experts and the FSC third party verifier. Next slide, please. So we have transparency and demonstration of progress. Now, this requirement repeats at the bottom of every section of the remediation framework. In this universal requirements section, it's a bit more complex because systems need to be set up that will automatically feed information towards the FSC third-party verifier. And that verifier oversees a remediation progress demonstration website. Now, this is the FSC official progress site. It is where official progress is recorded. And so this is where the only place that a claim can be made about how far along a particular company or organization is in their roadmap process. And this will be, it will only publish verified information. The third-party verifier will have verified that information and they will be able to plot how far along a company has made progress. And we hope that can be done in quite a simple way, a pictorial way, so it can be easily understood and information can be easily accessed. But there's other things within the remediation framework that need to be publicly reported and won't necessarily yet be verified by the third-party verifier, or there may not be a requirement for those to be verified. So the company does need to have its own website where it can communicate publicly, it can publish its policies, procedures, perhaps details of stakeholder consultation, meetings, etc. So that company must on its own website about a roadmap it must have a very prominent link back to that remediation progress demonstration website. So, and also explain that that's where official progress is reported. So it can publish all this other information that I've mentioned before, additional items as it sees fit, but no false or contradictory claims that aren't verifiable within the remediation progress demonstration website. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to pop into very briefly into section R, which is where we have the general remedy of harm procedures. But what we're focusing on right now will be the identification of the environmental and social harm. Next slide, please, Alex. So it's this requirement 3.3 that I'll be looking at now. Next slide. Okay, so in 3.3, we are looking to identify harm in another way. So this is maps and inventories of the past and current status in all the impact areas within a company group and supply chain. So these maps need to cover natural forest, high conservation value areas and values, it's not always areas, destroyed since 1999, natural forest converted since 1994. 1999, by the way, is different to 1994 because the HCV concept came in at that time. So illegal logging and encroachment needs to be recorded since 1994. High carbon stock areas, these are also added because these areas are increasingly mapped by companies and very pertinent in many areas where, not throughout the world just yet, but in many areas where we've seen cases. And there's an overlap in part with HCV. So land use and cover in general needs to be noted, and crucially, communities that are known to or suspected to have suffered harm. This links back to some of the rights and rights holder section in section U, the requirement rather for rights and rights holders. There's a mapping requirement there, and that links to that as well. But we'll not get into the weeds unless you want to in the Q&A. So in 3.3.3, that indicator is a registry of harm. And this is catching, it's designed to catch all places where harm may show up, where it may be realized. And those places are the grievance mechanism, the due diligence systems, the maps as above, and also asking that root cause of harm is identified and noted within that registry. Next slide, please. So here's a picture. So actually this picture includes something I didn't mention in the last slide, which is on the left-hand side, prerequisites, the acknowledgement of harm. So a company may know right at the beginning, yes, we know this has happened, we've seen it, we've done some studies, we want to acknowledge that, and we're putting it straight into the registry of harm. They may already have a registry of harm working, which would be great. Section U, covers the grievance mechanism and the due diligence systems that I went into in a bit more detail. They'll all feed in. And then section R that we just looked at, actual proactive mapping and inventory taking going into the registry of harm. Now, all these things together, then we've got quite a collection of issues potentially. And then these would need to be prioritized for remedy, and also pilot cases chosen. We'll get into that stage in the next webinar session, but for now, we're thinking about how is harm identified. And again, there's going to be independent monitoring, public summaries, etc. on the registry of harm. So the registry of harm, by the way, will never be published. Those details will be kept confidential. There's no requirement for that. Next slide, please. Okay, so diving even deeper and literally into the deep sea now, we felt an iceberg. An iceberg metaphor is probably the best here, since most trees don't have root systems quite as deep as icebergs go under the water. But maybe we could have used a baobab tree. But anyway, we're using icebergs because when there is a complaint about a PFA violation, and that complaint looks into the details, this is usually just looking at the parts that can be seen above the water. So essentially, it's the tip of an iceberg. So that complaints process is not looking at all potential harm within a company situation. So it's saying, is this complaint valid? Are there things happening here? It maybe will pick up a bit more wider information, but it's not a thorough full audit. Then sometimes what we're finding is many stakeholders are thinking, well, do we identify all the harm before we develop a roadmap? Or, you know, what happens here? So in the roadmap process for the draft APP process, then that process develops systems that would identify harm. So those mapping systems I went through, that was developed as part of that process. So our perception is that the company-specific roadmap is developed, and that is developed to include systems that will then identify the full range of harm. So all the iceberg that is under the water. And so actually that identification of harm is part of the remediation framework process. It's part of a roadmap process. And there is an attempt to fully do that before a roadmap has started, because so much of the roadmap and so much of this, you know, we talk a lot about 5 years. It is just an example time period. It's a likely time period, but so much of that 5 years will be really going deeply into, especially where it's a big company, this will take a while to go through these processes to identify harm and start remedying. So next slide, please. So then we're going to take a quick look at trust building measures here. And again, just one particular part. Next slide. And that's requirement 2.1. This is the most complex part of the trust building measures. And this is essentially the application of controlled wood to the company and suppliers. Next slide, please. So this is to mitigate risks in the wood and forest product supply chain. Obviously, when controlled wood is fully applied, then risks will reduce. Now, to make it really clear, when in a roadmap situation, when controlled wood is applied, it isn't for claims outside. There won't be controlled wood certificates. It's the company and the FSC third-party verifier will be using controlled wood standards as the audit protocols that they use to go in and check. So again, no claims could be made about controlled wood until after the end of disassociation, and unless specific controlled wood certification was gone through. So at this roadmap stage, pre-ending disassociation, what we're looking for a series of detailed steps, and these are captured in 2.1. So first of all, first priority suppliers need to be identified, second priority suppliers, and then all other suppliers. So I'm going to move on to the diagram on the next page because I think it's easier to understand. So firstly, first priority suppliers are going to be the suppliers where there is highest risk and where there's the greatest necessity to reduce that risk as quickly as possible. Second priority, kind of middle range risk, and all other suppliers looking at kind of a lower risk zone. So at the bottom, we see company group on all facilities in a company group. There's a kind of browny yellow colored arrow, and that represents the application of FSC standard 40005. So this doesn't mean everything going through a company facility is controlled wood compliant, but it does mean that there are systems to keep those streams of material apart, the controlled material and the not yet controlled material. So going back to the first priority suppliers, they will need to be controlled wood compliance prior to the end of disassociation. Then we have a couple of milestones, milestone 1 and milestone 2. Now the time period at which milestone 1 and 2, that will be set in the roadmap process. We don't specify that in the remediation framework, but we just talk about those milestones. So the second priority suppliers, they're all that material will need to be controlled wood compliant. So that means compliance with FSC standard 30010, standard that applies on the ground in the forest. And that will have to happen by the end of milestone 1. And then finally, milestone 2, this is both milestone 1 and 2 after the end of disassociation, and they will then need to come into play. So this is the case where we saw was in the diagram Salem showed that the remediation framework and company-specific roadmap will continue after the end of disassociation and continue to bring in more trust building measures such as controlled wood. And of course, after disassociation, these can be actual controlled wood certificates. So that grey area you see is the growing amount of controlled wood within the system. So next slide, please. So here's an overview of the next steps again. So we're coming to the end of our presentation. So we've got a good hour and a half now, 90 minutes, to really get into a discussion. And again, to emphasize, it doesn't have to be just about what we've talked about now in this presentation. It can be on any part of particularly sections U, section T, and the identification of harm parts. But if you have questions on the other parts, that's great. We can gather them up, either answer them now if we have time, or we take them into the next webinar. Next slide, please. I think I'll hand back to you, Amparo.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, for that very good presentation, as well as Salem earlier. We have quite a lot of activity in Slido, not so much in the chat in Zoom. And we have 7 questions, all of which come from Christopher.
Shall we have the, yeah, brilliant.
Yes.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for noting that. Before we go into the questions, and before I forget, I also want to mention to the audience that we have quite a lot of support from the FSC Board of Directors in this process, and there's actually 4 members in the audience, and that is Leo, Rulita, we have Per and Yvonne. So thanks so much for your support and for joining us today. And if you want to speak to this later, please just raise your hand. So should we go through the questions, Salem? Would you be the first one to answer these, or should we do it like that? Or they're quite specific in terms of content. So I think either you or Anna are able to answer them.
Sure. I think I can give the first, looks like the first, at least 2, if not 3 a go.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question, do rights holders and independent experts form part of the remediation governance body? And who compensates the remediation governance body for their time and resources? So the rights holders and independent experts are part of the remediation governance body. They have an active seat on the remediation governance body, which is composed again of rights holders, experts, stakeholders, and company group representatives. So the answer to number 1 is yes. They hold a seat on the remediation governance body and part of that decision making or reviewing group. Who compensates the RGB? So this is a question that we've had as well. And the intention or the concept is that the remediation governance body would would use self-management principles to actually create their governance model, and in the concept of self-management and self-governance, they would actually determine what their compensation would be and how they would go about managing compensation within the group. The organization ultimately, which is seeking to remedy, is responsible for providing the infrastructure and for providing the overall resources needed to operate the company specific roadmap. So that the overall financial resources would be the responsibility of the organization running the company specific roadmap. That's number
Thank you,
2.
Salem. Yeah.
Should I take number 3, or do you want to move?
Maybe I read them out loud in case somebody's not looking at the screen as well. Question number 3, I think is really interesting because they're questioning a little bit the need for additional experts, considering that there's social and environmental experts, including in the governance remediation body. So what is your take on that? What do we need extra experts outside that body?
I mean, the intention of having social and environmental experts as part of the remediation governance body is that these experts have experience in reviewing the kinds of documentation, the kinds of systems that the remediation governance body is responsible for. And so with their expertise combined with the perspectives and experience of rights holders and stakeholders combined, we felt that this provided a really strong and diverse group to be able to manage the kind of work that the remediation governance body will be exposed to and be governing. So for this is the thinking behind having all 4 of these groups interconnected, working together, and doing this work. I believe this question is about why would additional experts be needed?
I think there might be a misunderstanding here, Salem.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's social and environmental independent experts. It's not and independent experts. That's describing the type of independent expert. So I'm not sure, Christopher, if that's what you were meaning, but there's not like extra experts on top of social and environmental experts. They are rights holders, stakeholders, and then independent experts from social and environmental backgrounds. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but that was my perception when I read the question. Sorry, Salem, did you want to say something else on that?
No, I just I was going to say something similar.
Okay, sorry.
It's not. I read it a different way, but I hope that clarifies that question.
Thank you.
So yeah, actually, I've just had another question privately to me about what about experts on governance? Yes, that's true. That could be important to include an expert on governance within that. So, maybe Christopher's right. Maybe we do need some additional experts. That's a good contribution, and perhaps we need to take that at least into the guidance.
Good point. Let's maybe move on with the questions from Christopher because we are starting to get a queue. So question number 4 is regarding the due diligence. And as I understand, this question is who defines that due diligence that the companies need to implement? Is that specified in the roadmap, or do companies actually have a relative freedom there on what to decide? Is that something that you can answer, Salem or Anna?
I can maybe I can try this one. So the due diligence frameworks, there are 2 different due diligence frameworks laid out. There's a human rights due diligence framework as well as the environmental due diligence framework. Both of them call for a for the framework itself to be developed and methodologies for those frameworks to be peer reviewed and consulted. From this perspective, and as reflected in the guidance document, there's actually multiple human rights due diligence frameworks that are mentioned in the guidance, which lay out different important aspects for operationalizing the human rights due diligence framework that would be needed for the company specific roadmap. So from that perspective, yes, it's the company that is ultimately responsible for operationalizing, resourcing, implementing and managing the human rights due diligence framework. But the intention is to actually, through principles of continuous learning, develop a human rights due diligence framework, which is put together by best practice, which, from different organizations, from different experts to review and to feed into the development of that due diligence framework, to ultimately meet the needs of the company specific roadmap. So I would also see this as there are many elements of co-creation in the remediation framework, and the development of methodologies and these frameworks are based on these principles of co-creation. I hope that's probably another discussion point in and of itself, my response, but that's, I can tell you that's the intention of these due diligence frameworks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Salem. I think we're going to go to another stakeholder question since Christopher filed so many, but we will get back to you, Christopher, even if it's in writing. So Alex, can we scroll down to Yumiko's comment, because he was the next one commenting in Zoom? Yeah, he's asking about readiness assessments. Why are there readiness assessment and baseline assessment? What do they assess respectively? So I guess the question is really, what's the difference between them two? If either one of you could answer that question. Thank you.
Maybe I can answer this, Yumiko. So the readiness assessment is an assessment that FSC performs on organizations that indicate that they are ready to embark on an ending disassociation process with FSC. And the readiness assessment then reviews the company's, it examines where the company is today based on their legacy issues with the policy for association. Where does the company stand today in terms of addressing those issues, creating systems to prevent policy for association violations, to have reviewed the root causes of policy for associations in the past, and addressed those, the kind of sustainable forest management plans or company sustainability management plans, which have been put in place since the disassociation, that are reflecting what the company is working on and what they've done to address the issues, the policy for association issues from the past. So that's kind of the scope and idea of the readiness assessment.
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay, yeah. I was going to explain a few words about the baseline, but
please go ahead. Yeah.
The baseline assessment has been used in one case, and the idea of the baseline assessment was to replace or to provide data points due to a lack of a complaints panel investigation in the disassociation, which is required by the procedure for processing policy for association complaints. So that was the intention of that baseline assessment in the past. But it's I think indicated there as an as needed basis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have some comments from Tony Sebastian. Those were the next in line, but it's really not a question. He's just calling for balance between flexibility and inflexibility and the need for this framework to be applicable globally. So to that point, Tony, unless you want to share and talk to the audience, I would just invite you to bring all these thoughts through our public consultation because it's exactly the feedback that we're looking for. So hopefully you have some time to really provide those points in writing through our consultation platform. Next, we had a question from Hoa, and perhaps it was in Zoom. Or can you maybe, oh, it's up here. Yeah. In waiting for the approved remediation framework, which prior activities does the can the organization develop? So I guess the question is like, before this is finalized, what can companies start doing so that they start getting their work together and facilitating the process later on? Can you maybe speak some words to that, Salem?
Sure. I think in such specific cases, I think it's best to discuss this with FSC dispute resolution to understand what kind of background work organizations can be doing, because this is very case-specific work. The needs assessments will be very different for the kinds of activities that specific companies can be doing. So my suggestion would be to contact FSC to look at what possible activities could be done to prepare for company-specific roadmaps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then I think we should answer the questions from Sarah that also came a while ago, asking what are the criteria for third-party verifiers and who is establishing the remediation governance body, as well as the basis and rationale for the 5 years period on the remediation framework, both of which are really good questions. Would those questions also be addressed to you, Salem, or Anna, would you like to hop in for that?
Yeah, sure. I think I can answer to these. The criteria for establishing the third-party verifier. The third-party verifier is I believe we're talking about the FSC appointed third-party verifier. This is the same body that is reflected in the conversion remedy procedure. So these two remedy procedures or frameworks are using the same kind of infrastructure for verifying milestones, just to make that connection. And FSC will have to develop an accreditation framework for accrediting these third-party verifiers if they're to be different than conformance assessment bodies. So that's, Sarah, to be clear, there's not currently criteria that have been developed for the third-party verifier. This will be subject of an accreditation conversation around the establishment of the third-party verifier. The second question, the establishment of the remediation governance body is done as part of the company-specific roadmap, and it would be the company that would be responsible for publishing the terms of reference and advertising that they're establishing the remediation governance body the first time. And to go to the second question, the basis of the rationale for the 5-year period. So again, this 5-year period is an example based on our case management experience, but it could change depending on the company's specific roadmap. One which was very straightforward and easy, maybe you could imagine that period being 2 to 3 years. And for for a more complex case, that maximum period could be 7 years, maybe 8 years. So just the 5-year mark is just an example. But the purpose in putting a maximum time frame between starting the roadmap until ending disassociation is to ensure that there's a good pace in achieving milestones and that the company feels motivated and is incentivized to move through the roadmap process. But it's not there to use as leverage or pressure on coming to remedy agreements. So the intention is to ensure motivation and continual progress, but not to be used as putting intense pressure on coming to remedy agreements, which could actually delay or create further harm. So that's the intention.
Thank you for that clarification, Salem. I'd like to go back to the comment from Tony Sebastian, because there seems to be a lot of content there, and also allow you and Anna to perhaps comment back on the point on the flexibility and inflexibility and other points he's making with regards to the remediations governance body. Anna, would you like to speak to that point? Would you like to me to go over the comment?
You know, I can see the comment in the chat. Yeah, what I was really wanting to pick up on was about the remediation governance body. So Tony, wanting to ensure we are not placing governance into the hands of the harmed. So it would be for the rights holders to choose representatives to sit on that governance body. So, for example, in the case of perhaps harm in a labour situation, then a union may sit on that governance body on behalf of the workers that have been harmed. So of course it would be absolutely unwise to have people who are directly suffered harm sitting in a place of governance. But they do need to be represented in that governing role. There is clarification in the guidance on that, but maybe we can actually make that better. And thanks for the question, because it's really important that we do clarify that. And then I also wanted to pick up on, because it links to Natasha's question, which is, Natasha says it's difficult to see the distinctions between the remediation governance body and independent experts and peer reviewers. Both seem to have the same responsibilities, expertise, also are dependent. And the role of the stakeholders, rights holders review is anyway covered through the framework's requirements like consultation and monitoring. So this links really closely with Tony's comment, and that's that the governance of a process and sort of taking a role in the same way as being on the board of directors, it's very different to doing the actual operational work. So perhaps going out, undertaking risk assessment surveys, perhaps, you know, other important implementation pieces. That's what independent experts will be doing in actual implementation. And peer review is looking at, okay, what's happened? Has this been done in a good way in quite some micro detail? Whereas at a board of governance level, it's more of an oversight, and it's how will this work? So there are subtle differences, and I think given this feedback, we probably need to make that clearer and ensure it is clearer in the guidance. I'm not sure if you had time to look at the guidance yet. So back to Tony's comment on flexibility. Yes, completely agree that there needs to be flexibility where it's necessary, but also like strong implementation and not so much flexibility in other places. And so this is where we have the difference between when something's normative and perhaps where something's guidance, and also where we're trying to take more of an outcome orientated approach, where we're saying, okay, this is the absolute outcome needed, but the flexibility comes in that we're not saying this is precisely the only methodology that will deliver that. You need to find the methodology that works for you or this situation to bring out the outcome. And also just wanting to clarify, because I think it can be confusing for those who've been involved in the development of the generic roadmap and now the remediation framework. The remediation framework does actually have a global scope, whereas the generic roadmap was just focused on Southeast Asia. So hand back to you, Amparo.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question is about the timelines, and we have a question from Dewey Muhtaman. And he or she is asking about whether a company could be reassociated if they were in full compliance before the 5 years period. And then the second question is like, what happens if they fail to meet the 5 years? Is that something you could answer, Anna?
So what happens if the 5, I think that's one for Salem, perhaps, more than me. Salem, would you be up for that one?
Yeah, sure. So of course, the 5 year example is again to ensure that organizations have a good pace as they move through the milestones. But of course, if an organization is able to meet the milestones earlier than 5 years, then there's no penalty, or there's no problem with a company moving through their milestones and achieving ending disassociation earlier than the 5 year period. The 5 years is there to mark a point in time in which, if the company has not met that mark, that there would then be a review of where we've gotten to in the roadmap, a discussion about what are the obstacles, why ending disassociation milestones have not been reached. Is there something that we can do to facilitate better process or continuous improvement? Is there something that's not working? So there would be a larger conversation between FSC and the organization at that point to really try to remove obstacles and to ensure steady progress in ending disassociation.
Mm-hmm. And then linked to that question, Sarah is almost asking the same thing, but she's asking more the basis for defining 5 years. And I suppose not another. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, then next question would be from Ika Sira Marlia. And yeah, they're asking for more clarification about who appoints the parties in the remediation governance body and the independent experts, and how their roles are defined in the process. Is that something you could answer, Salem? Or Anna, would that question be for you?
Either or, I can give it a go. I mean, this very first iteration of the remediation governance body is the most crucial one, and it's also to be the hardest one to get to. And so prior to in the very early stages of this situation, then stakeholders and rights holders will be being identified. And so there will be key stakeholders starting to emerge, situations about any harm will start to be understood. And then with mapping out those stakeholders and rights holders, then related organizations and representatives of wider groups can be identified. And then there should start to be maybe some key candidates that would be good to start a very first remediation governance body. And it may be that that's an interim, just to get it going, just so that everybody can start to build trust that, okay, this body is semi-independent. Perhaps they'll establish even a voting process. Again, we're not stating exactly how this should happen, because actually that would be wrong of us. It would be too rigid. What we need is the outcome here that we need is this semi-independent governance body that all involved have some trust in, so that no matter who was asked, they could say, okay, well, this is an experiment for us, it's new territory, but we feel good because we've got this person and this person sitting on that group. And we have put a reasonable amount of guidance in the guidance paper on this, but we do want to make sure there is this flexibility, because it may be in certain places that using traditional models of governance may be the most appropriate thing to do. And certainly from our positions, we cannot possibly know about all those kinds of different systems that may be appropriate. Salem, did you want to say something? Because I think this is it's such a foundational point, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think I think one of the key pieces here is that FSC, the idea is that that the remediation framework would be applicable and implementable at a global level, and that the more prescriptive we get around the way in which the remediation governance body is to work, and the kinds of management principles they're to adopt, the more difficult it becomes to implement that across the globe. And so using principles of self-management and self-governance really allows for a more local and regional adaptation of this governance in all different kinds of settings and all different kinds of circumstances.
Thank you, Salem. We have also a follow-up comment related to the same thing that you were mentioning from Dharma One. And he's also raising some concerns around how to ensure the independence of the governance body. I believe you've already covered that point, but if you want to comment that any further, please do so.
I mean, I think, Dharma One, I would say, I think this point has been also raised by Tony. We do have some information on this, on the representation of rights holders in the guidance. Maybe this can be improved to take in your point and Tony's point more, to make it very, very clear what the idea or the relationship between the rights holder representation would be and the actual effective rights holders. So we can take a look at this.
Yeah, and I see Tony's just replied in the chat as well. By the way, we really do welcome your voices, and including in Bahasa Indonesian. So if you do feel that you would like to raise your hand and speak, then it's great to have an actual direct dialogue. But I can see Tony saying he feels the explanation from me about a proxy for the harmed appears to be the same thing. The interest of the harmed is what the process requires. How that articulates on the remediation governance body is key. So perhaps it would be great if you could speak, because I do feel a bit confused now, because the concern seems to be about the inclusion of rights holders, but we are absolutely, if we have the company involved in the remediation governance body, then that's also potentially a conflict of interest because they're all involved. So it's, this is governed by people who are connected to the involved situation, but they're maybe not like right at the core of it. So I'm wondering what you would feel would be better. I think that's my question to you. Yes, Tony, please speak. I think Amparo could.
Very good. Yeah, we're glad to hear
you.
somebody
great
sharing
to hear
their
from
thoughts.
you.
Yeah. I clicked ask to unmute. So I think, Tony, the floor is yours and you can share your thoughts with us.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, hi all, and hi Anna. Thanks for the explanations. I think what I've written down there is quite self-explanatory. The governance role has to be implicitly governance, and any sort of things that bring that allow the governing body to get in what the word would be operational. Yeah, governance versus operational. The selection and the interests that are represented on the governance body as described in the framework now lends itself to an intentional scuppering of the process. Yeah, placing the company on the RGB without the authority to influence it in its own interest is correct. So likewise, the other members of the RGB should be subjected to the very same, what you call, conditions, yeah, These are the limitations that you place. Governance is governance. You need to be able to take 2 steps back from the process to be able to govern all the processes. And the framework is putting together so many different processes and so many different reviews. I think this may be a job that you're asking too much from the RGB. And so this is where my concerns are coming from. I believe it needs to be taken, another look needs to be taken at it, purely from a governance point of view. Thank you. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tony. Those are very good observations.
Can
yeah.
I reply?
Yes, please.
So in the guidance, it really specifically says that the governance body is the governance body and it is not to get involved in any operational matters. It's pretty much almost exactly as you've said it there. So it is absolutely intended that this is real governance and that it truly is several steps back and that it is on the safe side of the operational line, on the board, on the governance side of the operational line. And my own experience of governance within FSC and as on the board of directors for another charity is that while we don't develop things when we're in a governance role, we do get to review policies and procedures and approve them or not approve them, or maybe give some feedback and say, actually, this needs a bit more work here. So that's the kind of governance that we're thinking of. I agree that definitely it seems like we do need to make this clearer. And I mean, the other alternative for governance would be just to remove it entirely and to put it in the hands of FSC. I'm not sure that that's actually appropriate. But yes, thanks for your comments. And it'd be great if you can give some written comments in the consultation to perhaps the detailed areas and let us know what we can get more right. But noted that perhaps we need to take another look and double check. I don't know if you had anything to add, Salem.
No, not from my side. Thank you.
We have some questions from Sarah, 2 of them that are shown here on the screen. She's asking about the 1994 timeline for, I suppose she means here, HCVs, and how harm is identified. Is that something, Salem, that you'd like to speak to?
Yeah, I think Sarah's actually talking about the HCSA here. I think this is correct. So if we go, if we could go back to that slide, Anna, on this is the requirement for mapping, or Alex, yeah. Yeah, right here. So the high carbon stock areas and those known to have been destroyed since 1994. So actually this is correct, that high carbon stock is only a recent development. The thinking here is actually that the high carbon stock maps could be used to establish environmental values in creating the maps and inventories. It's actually not a requirement, and this is it's not correct that there would be a requirement for mapping of high carbon stock areas back to 1994. So, but that the high carbon stock maps could be used to map environmental values, since those maps are becoming quite common. So that is a good point of clarification, and it's not a requirement that high carbon stock areas or high carbon stock damage would be traced back to 1994 as part of liability.
Thanks, Salem. We have a comment from Chris also on this point, saying that there seems to be duplication and that he recommends to stay with HCVs. And is that something that you like to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, again, So in looking at high carbon stock, what we're trying to do is use intelligently information which might already be there. Using maps from of HCS could be helpful for the creation of the maps needed here. That's what we're actually trying to do. We're not trying to look at destruction of HCS areas since 1994, but be able to map environmental values.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe we should also add that it's really important to revisit the policy for association and see the exact areas of what is an unacceptable activity. And so it's FSC can only, on the basis of those specific areas, be judging how a company, whether they've done enough or not. But it's a systems-based basis, the remediation framework. So it's saying like you need to look widely, and so that you can gather the information on what harm needs to be remedied or not in your system. You need to look very broadly here. But when it comes to the actual verification of has enough changed, has enough been remedied to end this association, and going forwards, are there enough plans in place to keep remedying those PFA policy elements? That's the pass-fail part. But the high carbon stock areas, this was quite important to the stakeholders in the APP stakeholder working group process. And so the insertion of that does come from that time, being a very crucial way of looking and evaluating those areas. But we agree that there is overlap.
Okay, thank you for that. We have one more question from Sarah regarding the independent monitoring, and then we'll go back to Christopher's questions because we have not answered all of them, and we would also like to respect the order of engagement. And after that, I'll give the floor to Dewi Muhtaman, who has raised a hand. So perhaps Salem or Anna, we can answer this question from Sarah with regards to the independent monitoring and requirement 182 and 192. Who is responsible for this independent monitoring?
That is a great question, Sarah, and it's such a great question that we're actually asking you guys that. So again, independent monitoring is a concept that came up for us in the APP roadmap process. And there are a number of options around independent monitoring. One is that it could be an independent third-party verification body. Another is that it could be maybe wider than that. We have the concept of independent observers who can join potentially different auditing type processes or monitoring processes. Maybe independent monitoring could allow perhaps maybe a local NGO to go and look at something. We're actually asking that question rather than saying the answer, because we also don't know who should be undertaking the independent monitoring. Some people might have a very strong opinion that it should only be suitably qualified independent third-party verifiers, qualified auditors, and then maybe independent observers can join them. But other people might say, okay, we think this should be a bit wider. We think that local NGOs should be able to go and do some independent monitoring. So that's actually one of the key stakeholder questions in the consultation. I don't know. I think you might be muted, Amparo. I'll pass it back to you.
Yes. I was just saying that perhaps Alex can scroll so that we can see the questions from Christopher that we hadn't responded yet. Yes. So he's got this comment on the duplication and registration of harm, which Perhaps you guys want to speak to that point. It does seem like a relevant one. Not sure if with this comment there's enough basis.
Definitely, all questions are relevant here, so we welcome them all. A bit of duplication and overlap in the registry of harm. Christopher, do you mean like because it's coming from all directions? We would see that duplication as helpful because we need to catch it from all directions. But do you mean like, do we have to see things done again in every place? No, we would want to see them as connected up. The place where everything would need to be captured is in the mapping. So the mapping would be assisted by what was already known in a registry of harm. It would really help to focus down on, okay, well, it's quite clear we've got some problems in these communities here. Let's go and have a closer look. Let's make some maps. So we would see that that kind of what might be perceived as duplication as being guiding. So sounding off maybe a little warning, like a smoke alarm, saying, okay, over here, there's a problem. And the same with the grievance process, because obviously not everybody would use a grievance mechanism. You know, there's a lot about trying to make sure that people know that there is a grievance mechanism and that there is access to remedy, but not everybody would do that. So it may be that in risk assessments and then impact assessments, something is picked up separately, and so on and so forth. So I guess it is kind of what we say sometimes belt and braces with safety catches. But it is like coming from different angles. Salem, I don't know, did you have a perception on that? Maybe we could look again at the diagram, Alex, which shows in the full presentation. There's a diagram that shows all the different inputs in. Yeah, that's right, that one. And actually there's an arrow that goes all the way around the top of this diagram. So that's to show that, you know, what's acknowledged prior to entering the roadmap is eventually going to need to be verified, and the extent of it will be seen through the mapping. And the same, you know, showing all these interconnections that they feed into each other, and one will alert the other. So we're only going to catch a little bit of harm through the grievance mechanism, you know, some definitely, a little, and some through the due diligence system as well. And then, you know, the mapping may be pretty much already mostly done in some areas because of the good work of the due diligence system. So this definitely is a safety catch, and to give an overall very clear picture.
Thank you for those clarifications. Then perhaps we go back to the questions so that we continue clarifying those coming from Chris that we haven't covered yet. Yeah, the next question that we haven't answered yet is the need for clarification regarding the HCS maps, and based on what and how does it contribute to the outcome? I'm not sure I understand the question myself, but can you, Anna, perhaps talk to this point based on your comment?
So we have talked about this a little bit already. We should have probably, sorry, Christopher, we should have brought your comment in there. So the reason for the high carbon stock maps, it does come from the deep stakeholder work we did in the stakeholder working group. So that's where this comes from. There is some overlap with the high conservation value. What does it contribute to the outcome? Well, maintaining high carbon stock, for example, is really crucial to maintaining good climate and all the other benefits from keeping the carbon in the ground and not in the atmosphere. And health and well-being being the right to health and well-being being a human right, and human rights being covered by the PFA. So you need to do a few steps away from, you know, or down the line of what it means to maintain human rights. Then maintaining high carbon stock is pretty important to all of us for our right to well-being. So that would help contribute to an outcome of stable ecosystems and maintaining also all the high conservation values that may be dependent on that high carbon stock. So how does it contribute to the outcome? Yeah, I hope I've answered that there. I think I'll leave it there, Christopher. And if you've got more detail that you'd like to add, you know, please put it into the Zoom chat or back into Slido, or raise your hand, and it would be good to discuss it further to make sure we've interpreted it right.
Thank you, Anna. We now give the floor to Dewey Muttaman, who has been very patiently waiting with his hand raised already for a while. So Dewey, please feel free to share your thoughts about this process and this framework. We're looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Anna. I would like to follow up with the discussion on HCS and HEV, particularly on HCS. It says that this remediation will take a look at the HEV since 1999. I understand that in terms of recollect the status of HEV for HEV 1, 2, 3, and 4, probably we can do through the virtual satellite images analysis and all those maps available from 99 until today. However, the critical issues is for the HEV 5 and 6, which is it needs particular social processes to really can dig down the issues way back in 1999. What this framework expect from identify or from understanding what HEV 1 to 6, particularly 5 and 6 for social HEV, to understand the destruction. I think, I mean, if this will be applied, I mean, for particularly for HEV 5 and 6, then certainly it will take more time to really understand what happened for the old days until recent situation.
Yeah, I really think you're raising like such an important point there, and I can't disagree with anything you say, because it's much more challenging, HCV 5 and 6. It will take longer, it will take a different skill set, it will take most probably very different kinds of experts, and we should expect that it would be slower, I'm sure. And this is a case where removing the pressure of, you know, a time pressure that, oh, you must do it in this time, otherwise you will have failed your roadmap, failed remediation framework. It's much better to do these things in good time, in a good way, and a way that trust can be built in the communities where you're trying to assess, okay, HCV 5 and 6. So yes, you know, there's obviously a lot of guidance out there on assessing HCVs, and so we do cross-reference to that guidance. But I'm sure it's something that we're going to be able to write better guidance on if we look more closely as part of the stakeholder consultations, but also in gaining experience when there are like first pilot cases, because we request pilot cases within the remediation framework. But of course, roadmaps developed from the remediation framework will themselves need to be piloted and will be pilot cases. So
Exactly.
then we'll learn coming back. So I'll hand back to you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I agree. That's why I think the whole framework, time frame for this remediation processes is really have a lot of flexibility. Otherwise, it's quite very challenging to comply with the fixed time frame. So with my previous question, for example, what about if the company can speed up the process? It's okay. It's still of course good to see if the company really can speed up the process, and if the case in the case of need longer time, then yeah, it's also need to be discussed why the reason extended time needed. Yeah, I think flexibility is the key to this remediation framework, Anna. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, that's well noted. And we are, by the way, taking detailed notes of this session, and everything you're saying comes into the stakeholder consultation, and we consider it on the same basis as if it was written submission. So thank you, thanks for that one. Back to you, Amparo.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments, Dewi Mutaman. We look forward to hearing from people also on their comments. Besides writing questions on the chat box, I think it gives a good dynamic and discussion, which is what we're looking for. I'd like to invite to anybody else that wants to have the floor and really share their comments with the audience. Please feel free to do so, but otherwise you can of course write the comments in the chat box and we'll represent them for you with the audience. We have one more question that we haven't yet answered, which was from the beginning of the session from Christopher, and it's this question we have in front of us about the two websites and why we have two of them, recommending to really only have one. Anna, is this something that you would like to comment on, this question?
Yeah, the reason we have two websites is because the FSC website would only be verified information, and that there is actually, when you go through the remediation framework, there's quite a lot of other information that is called for to be made publicly available. And actually, the FSC website may not be the best or easiest place for stakeholders to be able to find that information, because that stakeholder may not even know that there's an FSC process going on. So they may live in an area and maybe they're thinking, oh, what is happening here with this forestry company? They may know the name of that forestry company. And so then they look up the website of that forestry company. And so, you know, they'll need to be able to publish some of these things that require to be publicly made publicly available. Maybe it is about consultations coming up. And because some of these things won't have like a roadmap label on them, they're just systems things, part of the infrastructure that just needs to happen anyway. So in that respect, it makes more sense that it's on the company's own website. But then we're trying to be very clear about, you know, what kind of claims could be made where there is the overlap into the roadmap area. And it's very important that only the FSC website could make the claims about progress. So that's why we've got two. And again, perhaps maybe we don't have the balance quite right. There is quite a lot of detail in that section. So I would advise to read 1.10 and the guidance and see if you think, Christopher, that, yeah, is it the wrong balance? Are we getting something wrong there? And certainly we really welcome the feedback on the detail.
Thank you for that clarification, Anna. Yeah, I think it's always good to hear this kind of comments also through the consultation. I believe we have covered all the questions so far through Slido and Zoom. So I'll hand over now to Salem, who I believe wants to ask a question openly to everybody and see what their feedback is.
Yeah, thanks, Amparo. We still have a few more minutes for this webinar, and so I would like to I guess ask a general question in terms of the overall layout of the remediation framework and the ability to use that document and to understand it, because of course it's gone through a major facelift in this revision now. How keen are you on approaching this document, and how are you finding the organization?
We'll leave maybe a couple of minutes for the audience to comment on that, perhaps in writing, or somebody maybe wants to speak to that point, and you can raise your hand. There's no answer so far to this question. Would you like Salem to ask another question, see if there's more input to that, or there's also some other new comments in the chat box that are unrelated to this, so we can also attend those.
Yeah, no, it's fine. We can attend to the questions that are coming through.
The question is from Christopher and is really directed to Anna, following from her last comments. So his point there is that Anna's response seems to go to some extent against what FSC members are calling for in terms of transparency, it says. So I suppose this all relates to the website clarification we provided earlier.
Yeah, Christopher, I'm sorry you feel it is as strong as to go against what members are calling for. We hope it does reflect the call for transparency, because throughout the remediation framework, there it says very specifically what will be published on that website, and everything that's published on that website needs to be verified. So it's not that there isn't going to be transparency, it's more recognizing that it's a both and situation rather than either or situation. So we need to have both things, because not everything in the remediation framework that is asking to be published is necessarily appropriate for FSC to publish, because then it's behaving like a proxy for a company. But there's a really very large amount that does need to be published on that website. And I'm just thinking out loud here, like thinking about your comment, maybe it would be a really good idea if we gathered all those things together in one place. In the end section on transparency and demonstration of progress for each section, we do have a list of everything that needs to be published on that FSC website. But I'm thinking perhaps maybe we could make an annex, which was like a full list of everything. And I think perhaps that might be helpful. But yeah, we absolutely welcome your detail, and you've said you'll have a look at the guidance and provide comments in the consultation. Thanks for that, because it's absolutely not our intention, or even mine personally, to go against what FSC members call for in terms of transparency. I feel pretty passionate about working on behalf of those members. So thanks, Christopher.
Thank you, Anna. It's good to reinforce the point that transparency is absolutely critical for FSC and also for this process. We have a very good comment from Tony Sebastian. asking if if it's foreseeable that there could be a disassociation based on one single non-compliance that doesn't involve environmental or social matters, where the remediation could be quite straightforward, in which case I assume the remediation framework would be, as he mentions, strongly overkill. Has this been considered? I think it is a good comment here. Would you like to speak to that, Anna, or should we hand over to Salem for this?
I think this one's more one for Salem.
Okay.
First of all, anyway, if that's all right, Salem.
Yeah, no, of course. So I think, Tony, that's an interesting question. And of course, we have tried to address, we have tried to address this remediation framework in a modular approach, in the sense that the unacceptable activities in which which need addressing would then plug into the remedy process on an at-needs basis. I'm trying to think of an unacceptable activity which would not involve harm. I mean, we had theoretically thought about such a case and came to the conclusion that even in such a case where you would not have identified harm, that the only way to come to that conclusion is to go through the harm evaluation. But we did consider this case in running through the framework and testing it, and came to the conclusion that even in addressing a remedy for an unacceptable activity that that did not involve harm, in order to establish that there's no harm, you would still need to go through a harm evaluation. And then at the end, you might not have anything in your registry of harm. You might not have anything then, any harm to ultimately remedy, and you would be able to come to the closing of your milestones rather quickly. So from that perspective, from us running through this hypothetical example, we came to the conclusion that in such an unlikely scenario, you would be able to run through the remediation framework and follow the steps, even if you came to the conclusion that indeed there was no harm to remedy. So I think that in such an unlikely example, I do still think the remediation framework is applicable. I hope that answers your question, Tony.
Thanks, Salem. Tony, if you want to comment back to this, we would be interested in understanding if you have specific scenarios where you perhaps think it's not as unlikely that this happens. Definitely good for us to also shape this framework around that. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand again if you would like to comment on this point further, Tony. We would be happy to hear further. So far, we have replied to all the questions in the chat box. I can see there seems to be an issue with Slido where the previous questions are gone, but luckily I think we covered them all already. So hopefully we'll be able to retrieve them later and provide them to you. But yeah, if you see that the questions are gone from the platform, don't worry about that. It seems like everybody is facing that trouble at the same time, but you can continue using.
It's not a trouble, Amparo.
It's not.
It's as we answer them, we tick them off. So they
okay.
leave Slido. Sorry, we're Slido novices, our team all together, all of us. So
I thought they would be there until.
Yeah, we can put them all back again as well. So we can see them in the archive.
Yeah.
So just tick them off as we answered them, so we could see which ones were left.
Okay, good to know. No, I think it's good. Like this is also clear that we have resolved them since they're not there. So we still have another 25 minutes that we had planned, not necessarily because we wanted to cover 2.5 hours, but to really make sure that everybody would have a chance to ask questions or comment or whatever necessary, because transparency and stakeholder engagement is really a priority for us. So perhaps we'll give a couple of minutes for people to have a chance to further comment or raise their hands to make sure that there really is enough opportunity for contributions here. So please, anybody feel free to comment any further or ask any questions you might have.
Par, I'm wondering if Tony would like to speak, because he said that I had not answered his question.
Tony, I'm muting you that now, and I'll give you the floor if you want to follow up on that comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the question is basically testing your framework. I'm sitting here looking at it and coming at it from different points of view, because that's what we need to do to see how robust it is, right? And the questions that come, and they are and they will be, or they could be in the future, cases where a member is disassociated, or there could be a disassociation scenario around what do you call it? That does not involve one of the 6 unacceptable activities. And but the remediation framework is going to be built into the whole PFA. The PFA, remember, is about a system to protect FSC, the whole system. Okay? So anything that attacks the system or affects the system, there is a way to protect, to punish, and as well as to remedy. So this is how the 3 bits fall together. And it just needs to be tested. So that's why my question came out. And I wasn't out there really to put you into a spot. It's about testing the framework and seeing how it works in the greater system for its purpose. So I'm not going to drag it down this road. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. I don't know, Salem, if you want to answer to that, or if we should park this for now. I mean, in any case, I think it's very useful to hear how the framework may or may not work, so that we can also adapt later, right? This is a draft. So if Salem doesn't have further comments to that, we can perhaps give a few minutes to the audience to ask other questions that they might have, or further comments or reactions.
Maybe we can just go back to the process slide just to remind people where we are and what's coming next, while they're thinking of any further questions. Yeah, this one right here. Thanks, Alex. So this is where we are. We're in the consultation period. This public consultation is open until the 21st of August. We're planning now the next technical webinar for the 22nd of July. Just as a reminder, we're going to be looking at that webinar at the crossovers between the conversion remedy procedure and the remediation framework, as well as covering the other aspects of the remediation framework that we have not covered in this session. So for those of you that haven't registered for that session, please do so. We can put the link into the chat so that you have that, or you can of course go to the processes page on the FSC website and register directly from there. We also have, in parallel to this public consultation, of course, the public consultation on the conversion remedy procedure, and you have a few more weeks to comment on the policy for association revision, which is open for public consultation, I believe, until the 17th of July. So you have just 2 weeks more to participate in that public consultation. So let's see, it looks like maybe there might be one more question to field. And Paro, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. The question comes from Christopher, and he's asking, could it be explained the reason for the second 60-day consultation actually needed for this framework? Over to you, Salem, since it's a process question, rather straightforward one, I think.
Yeah. So the proposal for the second period of consultation is really based around the connection pieces to the conversion remedy procedure, which are not well laid out in the current version of the remediation framework, nor are they reflected in the conversion remedy procedure. So connecting those pieces is going to be a big piece of the second of this revision phase that we will enter in October through December. The other piece of work that's still open is the requirements and indicators for use of GMO in forestry operations. This work will need to be connected to the future forest discussion and plug into that process in order to feed this into the remediation framework. So if we're able to make that happen by the end of this year, then we would also go to public consultation on that aspect. But we think that the process and the scope for articulating the ending disassociation framework should be very close to complete by October of this year. And that the remaining pieces, the connectors to the conversion remedy procedure, as well as the GMO piece, and perhaps a few other pieces around the pre-association remedy will need to be consulted only next year. That's the thinking behind that, Christopher.
Thank you, Salem. We'll give perhaps another minute for additional questions that may come up now that we're close to the end of the session. We have still 15 minutes that we had blocked, so we would have time for further questions, but I don't see much activity so far. And if there's no additional questions, then we would perhaps do the poll to see how people are feeling about this process so far and their level of agreement. So since we have no more questions and comments, I think we can now do the poll. Alex, if you don't mind launching that poll. I hope everybody has like 1 more minute to answer this so that we have a good understanding at the end of your level of agreement here. So far, very good results. We have now 45% of the people that have voted. Maybe let's wait a little longer to have a more representative figure. We have now 13 out of 24 participants that have voted. Ideally, some more participants will vote so that we have a good understanding of what your thoughts are, but I can see that the number doesn't really go up, so there's not engagement from the rest of the group. So we'll just give it a few more seconds. Okay, Alex, maybe we can end the poll here. We have 62% of the people that participated answering and sharing the results with the rest of the group. And we can see that 53% of the participants today actually agree with the suggested path forward, which I think it's definitely very good news. We have some indifferent stakeholders, so that's not so great. And for those that that disagree, either strongly or to some extent, we have plenty of opportunities for engagement moving forward in the different consultations and all the different technical webinars that we're going to do. So there will be opportunities for you to contribute and make sure that you actually agree on the final version of this framework. So with that, I think we can close the session. Thank you everybody for your time. It has been a rather long session, but very constructive in terms of engagement. And we hope to see you in the next session, which is on the 22nd of July, where we will cover the other half of the framework. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks for your time, and talk to you soon, I hope. Bye.
Thank you, Amparo. Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.